So we are going to get started. Fun fact, this was our original name of this session, but it was too long for too many characters. So we did start. So if you're here for Centering Queer and Trans Students of Color, you were in the right place. We just didn't change the slide because we like this title. Hi, Arturo. Nice to have y'all here. Hey, Emily. That's our friend. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. And I'm sure people may drift in and out as we go, but welcome. Thank you so much for making the time this Friday afternoon to spend with us. So our session is Imagining a University Built for Queer and Trans Students of Color. It's hopefully going to be very interactive and more like a conversation than a presentation. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right in, and we'll have time to talk about who we are and what we're doing. So our very short agenda today is we're going to start with our facilitators are going to introduce ourselves. You all are introducing yourselves in the chat, which I love. Thank you so much. We'll have some very basic community agreements that'll help our conversation. There'll be a little bit of framing what we're talking about. So just a tiny bit of presentation just to give you some sense of some of the research and theory that we're using to kind of conceptualize what we're talking about today. Most of our time will be a quick activity. It'll actually be a self-reflective activity you'll be working on, and then we'll have time to debrief. So let's do that. So our facilitators today, I'm going to suggest we go in the order on the slide, that we just go in alphabetical order, if y'all are okay with that.
Yeah, that works. Hi, y'all. My name is Shelby Hearn. I use they and she pronouns interchangeably. So when you're talking about our session later, you can use both. I'm the coordinator of education and outreach in the LGBT Resource Center. Excited to chat with y'all today.
Cool, that means it's my turn. Hi, friends. My name is Jessica Hernandez. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the grad assistant in the office. And I'm also a second year in the Master's Educational Leadership and Policy program here at the U. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, and I am Dr. Claire Lemke, she, her, hers. I'm the director at the LGBT Resource Center. Coming up on 2 years at the university. My work anniversary is actually next week. Very excited to be here. And I'll just add to this some of the framing of kind of who we are. You know, we each enter into this space differently. So for myself, I'm a white cisgender woman who works in EDI spaces in higher education, and some of the ways that I've navigated that space and noticing the ways that I do that differently than my colleagues of color, right? So paying attention in those ways to our experiences here. But I would also say, you know, something was really important to the three of us when we were thinking about how do we want to approach this topic, was to just be very clear and upfront with you from the beginning that this wasn't going to be like a presentation where we're experts that have some kind of special knowledge about what it means to support queer and trans students, but rather to say, you know, we are people who are in this work every day, who are examining our own limitations and biases every day, and who are trying to think of ways to be better and do better, especially within the space of an LGBT resource center, which historically are very white dominated spaces. And certainly that history impacts us here. So we're not coming to you today as people who have all the answers, but what we're hoping is to invite you as colleagues and as partners in this work to be in this moment with us and to really talk through how this impacts you in your professional life or your personal life when you're thinking about how you are serving queer and trans students of color, how you are making space for queer and trans students of color in areas where you have influence. So we're going to have some time to talk about that in a few minutes, but really hoping that you're coming to the space ready to share, because everyone who's here has a lot of great experience and insight to give as well. So thank you for joining us in the conversation today. Okay, some quick community guidelines. So these are some basic things that will help our conversation be productive. So we come into this space with just sort of a baseline of respect, meaning that we respect that everyone here is coming with different experiences, different identities, different backgrounds. We respect that and ask that you respect the same of us. We do ask people practice no outing, which is, this work can be really personal. And so there might be things that are shared in our conversation today where someone shares a personal experience or something about how they identify. And we ask that you keep that here if someone does that, right? So take away the ideas from this session, but leave names and identities attached to those here. Move forward and move back. That simply means sort of pay attention to how much space you're taking up in the conversation. So maybe you're that really excited, extroverted person who can sometimes unintentionally dominate the conversation. If that's you, I would challenge you before unmuting yourself to talk, maybe count to 8 in your head to give those introverts a chance to get into the conversation. But maybe if you're that introverted person, I'm going to challenge you today to contribute. And it doesn't have to be through your voice. It can be through the chat. So please just kind of think about that in the conversation. We also really want you to ask questions and take what you need during the session. So that means feel free to chime in the chat, to unmute yourself and chime in with voice if you have a question or if something's not working. So, we're in the wild world of Zoom presentations and things go wrong. So sometimes we might be saying, oh, I'm sharing this with you, or I dropped this in the chat. If you can't see it, or if you can't access it, or if it's really small, chime up and let us know. So at this point, I'm going to ask you all, is there something else you would like to add to our agreements today? And you can unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat, whatever works for you. I was counting to 8 for the introverts. All right, let's move on. Let's move on forward. We're all good with this.
Okay.
Shelby, I'm passing over to you.
All right. So, hi again. My name is Shelby. If you missed that earlier, so we're here today to talk about how and why we in higher ed regularly fail our queer and trans students of color, and how we can go about making individual and structural change towards prioritizing our queer and trans students of color in our policies and practices. This failure that we're referencing here is not as simple as failing to engage queer and trans students of color or falling short of learning outcomes, but we're failing our students by subjecting them to violence that's been embedded in the very foundations of our institutions and the research that informs our daily practices as educators. So we have a quote here from Patton's Disrupting Post-Secondary Prose Toward a Critical Race Theory of Higher Ed that essentially argues that higher ed from its very beginning has played and continues to play an active role in persisting inequities throughout the United States. That has looked like the fact that our country's foremost universities were built by slaves or otherwise profited from the slave economy, and others having stolen land from Native Americans, and even the very research and knowledge that our institutions produce has been used to justify and hold up racist, homophobic, and transphobic violence throughout history and even today in modern day. And this history shows how whiteness is centered in all that we do, whether we're actively aware of it or not. Here we're using a concept of whiteness that's brought by Stewart and Nicolazzo's article, High Impact of Whiteness on Trans Students of Color. And their concept of whiteness is that it's a way of knowing, an epistemological perspective that drives white supremacy through various systems of oppression, not just racial oppression. That whiteness in higher ed privileges certain ways of being and positions them as things that we consider normal or the average or the expected. That's expressions of and structures of gender or normal relations among and between racial groups. What a normal family looks like, a normal sexual desire, a relationship, that list goes on. But what does this actually look like in our practices, physically in practice? Whiteness is all throughout the research that has informed our policies and practices that we use today. Stuff that we hold up as highly impactful for student success and engagement, things that particularly if you have a background in student affairs or higher ed administration, things that you were taught as a student to practice as a practitioner for your students' success. But these policies and practices were created for the norm of white, cisgender, heterosexual, middle class men, 18 to 23, rather than with the needs and experiences of queer and trans students in mind. So some examples of that looks like access to what is considered a high impact practice of study abroad, which assumes access to government IDs like passports, or the ability to leave the country extendedly, or might not take into account how students of color encounter travel in a post 9/11 world, or the practice of reimbursing students or student organizations for expenses related to their involvement. That assumes access to funds upfront or credit. Internships or experiential learning set up without the needs of queer and trans students in mind can put a student in the position of facing queer antagonistic and racial biases with little or no support, rather than helping them actually succeed in those places and succeed in their area of study or work. So in recent years, higher ed researchers have been examining how these biases and the persisting negligence impacts queer and trans students of color. And so I'm going to pass it on to Claire.
Yeah, just a very quick rundown. So what Shelby's talking about, right, is a really like institutionalized approach to even how we think about our purpose here, how we define student success, how we structure our programs and services and access to those things. And so these are, some of the takeaways from current research in the field on how that actually impacts queer and trans students of color in college. So as a group, right, often underserved, left out of the conversation or current research. If you want to do a lit review on queer and trans students of color, it's probably going to have been published in the last 15 to 20 years. And it's probably a pretty quick project, right? You're not going to find a whole lot. Students reporting feeling isolated on campus, reporting that they feel like they're unable to be whole, meaning that they feel like they kind of have to choose which pieces of themselves to lead with. So am I going to enter into this white dominated space and leave my racial or ethnic identity kind of in the background? Or am I going to enter into this space where I connect around a racial and ethnic identity, but have to put my LGBTQIA plus identity in the background, right? So finding very few programs, student org spaces on campus that really affirm them in their wholeness. Experiencing microaggressions both within and outside of queer and trans communities, and finding that that has an exponential negative impact on mental health, not feeling connected to campus life, not seeing their experiences reflected in programs or services, not finding mentors or seeing university leadership who share their identities, and feeling being put in the position of being tokenized and burdened with educating not just their peers, but their but staff working with them as well. So these are some of the larger takeaways of how our current system impacts queer and trans students of color.
I have two screens and my mouse gets lost. I can't unmute myself immediately. So we've named the problem, how it's impacting our students. I know I never want to be the person who's full of problems without presenting a solution. Which is where the concept of trickle up high impact practices comes in. It's a practice proposed by DL Stewart and Nicolazzo, and it's based in Dean Spade's idea that social justice trickles up, not down. That a social justice approach to any sort of practices within higher ed or without prioritizes the needs of our most vulnerable, our most marginalized, and the benefits of that prioritization trickles up to everyone. In higher ed, that looks like developing policies and practices with queer and trans students of color, not just prioritized, but developing them alongside queer and trans students of color, not creating things for them, but making sure that we're doing these things alongside the communities that we're purporting to support. And at the end of the day, this will benefit all of our students through, again, Dean State's concept of trickle up social justice. A helpful framework in developing trickle up practices is Love's liberatory consciousness. A liberatory consciousness requires us to ask ourselves and our colleagues about goals, what we can do to support queer and trans students of color, and then how can we do it better? And then how can we do it better? Continuing to ask those questions in a constant cycle. There are 4 components to a liberatory consciousness: awareness, analysis, action, and accountability. Awareness is, it's a commitment to continuous education, figuring out what are the needs of queer and trans students of color at your institution or in your specific department, in your office. How are they currently experiencing your services or your policies, and what are their needs in response to those experiences? And then analysis is in engaging in those constant questions of what are our intended outcomes, what are the outcomes that we're getting right now, and questioning what our current methods and norms are and how they're possibly impacting students. Are they impacting them positively, negatively? Are they impacting students at all? Are you coming into contact with the students that you want to support? Action is taking steps towards positive change. I want to caution that action without the other components of liberatory consciousness can result in continuing to perpetuate harm if you're not aware, if you're not consistently analyzing, and if you're not holding yourself and others accountable. And accountability, that consists of constant communication within and across groups. So not just within your own office or your own team, but across other areas of your institution, and again, in communication with the communities that you're wanting to support. It involves being transparent and open to critique at all times, and holding everyone to high expectations and consistent practice. Having trans inclusive policies around names and pronouns, for example, does trans students very little good if that's not consistently practiced across an institution, and that all faculty and all staff are aware of those practices and are doing so consistently. So that's the 4 A's of a liberatory consciousness, and you'll use these 4 A's here shortly to ask yourself the necessary questions to build positive change in your own roles and in your own departments, offices, institutions. Before we head into that activity, we want to make space here for some questions. I am trained to be very comfy with silence, and so I will give us just a little bit longer for people to kind of let this rapid fire information percolate and see if there are any questions before we move forward. Okay. Go into our activity piece then. Jess, would you like to take folks through what we're going to be doing together?
Definitely. Thanks for that background, Shelby and Claire. So for this activity, we're going to ask you to think about your sphere of influence, whether that be a student org that you run, your department, like student staff members you advise, whatever that may be that you have influence over. What would it mean to have awareness, analysis, action, accountability when thinking of serving and supporting queer and trans students of color? So I will put this link in the chat. We'll probably try to do it a couple ways just to make sure y'all have access. Here's a link to a Google Doc. And I'm also going to try to file share so y'all have a Word doc if that's easier. Let me know if you, oh, nope, does not let me do file share. We figured that much. Okay, so the Google Doc probably is going to be our best bet. And then we can screen share a bigger image too, if that's helpful.
I do wonder, is it maybe because you're not the host you can't file share, Jess?
Oh, maybe.
Shelby, do you want to give it a try and see if we can get the file in there?
Yeah, I can do that while Jess is walking people through the.
Yeah, thanks for being patient with us, y'all. If you do have access the link to the Google Doc, you will see that first question again is thinking about your sphere of influence and what would it mean to have a liberatory consciousness in your workspace? And you'll go through it and then you'll write your action down, expected outcomes, challenges and barriers you might face, resources needed, resources that are available, and then allies and accomplices across campus, in your network, whatever that may be. And then after that, you'll think about your power and positionality, thinking about what experiences and knowledge and understandings do you need to keep in mind in terms of how your own gender and sexuality and race intersect. And then make sure you're getting those action steps in. So we are creating SMART goals and then a proposed timeline. And lastly, this document is adapted from a transformative action plan provided by Dr. Hubane, and then again, those liberatory consciousness from Love 2010. Did we get the?
So it looks like we can see that Shelby added a file. Can you see that? That was the question. So if someone could type in the chat or unmute themselves, do you see an actual file? Yes, cool. All right, you have your own copy. Great. Cool. And
Cool.
saw that comment about there. Perfect.
Yeah. So probably about 10 or 15 minutes, y'all. And then you don't have to finish today. You have a copy to take home, work on, take back to your workspace, your student org, whatever. And then probably around like 45, maybe we'll do a wrap up and debrief. Sound good? Cool, thanks. And I cannot share lo-fi beats because Shelby is screen sharing, but if Shelby wants to put lo-fi beats on.
Oh, the indignities of Zoom. Ugh. Never works. Yes, we're independently filling it out because we are unable to do breakout rooms with this particular configuration. So you're getting some time to reflect by yourself, and then we will come back as a group and share out.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. Sorry, I didn't clarify.
Why not?
Well, I don't know. I thought I'd be for it at first, but you just don't seem to match up.
And the fool's with me.
Well, maybe so, but all the same, now you can't do it.
No.
No.
Come around about noon tomorrow. I mean today. Snob.
What do you mean, snob?
Made up your mind awfully young, it seems to me.
Well, 30's about time to make up your mind. And I'm nothing of the sort, not Mr. Connor.
The time to make up your mind about people is never. What have classes to do with it? What do they matter except for the people in them? So much thought and so little feeling, Professor.
That was a perfect fade out. I love it. Okay, how did that go for y'all? Any challenges that came up? Anyone want to share their action plan? Like Shelby, I can wait. I'm a teacher's kid, so I have the quiet ability.
And feel free to type some thoughts if you're more comfortable doing it that way than with voice. I'm happy to share a little bit while we're waiting. If folks want someone to break the ice on what I was working on in mine. So when I was thinking about our office in particular, the LGBT Resource Center. And so when I was thinking about those kind of four stages, liberatory practice, awareness meant kind of having awareness that there's a problem with our current system, having some awareness of the needs of queer and trans students of color, that stem from doing research or professional development, analysis, meaning like actually looking at our programs and services and asking like, are there barriers? Where are the barriers that limit the participation of queer and trans students of color or push out queer and trans students of color? So I think for our office, we're probably somewhere within these first two stages, honestly, if we're just being really transparent. Like we've started doing some of the work of, say, reviewing our job applications or our scholarship applications and asking some of those questions about what barriers there might be in place. Or we've started to do some work putting together just like the foundations of some affinity space for queer and trans students of color. But well, there's still a lot more that we're needing to do in that piece of working alongside students. So we've been talking more about trying to connect more with students, particularly student volunteers that might want to kind of drive the direction of some of the work that we're talking about doing. But it also involves a lot of trust building on our part, which in this particular climate has been really difficult to do. So I would say we're probably within these first two stages as an office right now, kind of needing to do more before we can really do some of that impactful action without doing harm, as Shelby was mentioning. And I think what action steps would look like once we get more into it would be planning programs or resources alongside students with their vision, sometimes just getting out of the way and giving students resources, be that space or money or university approval, just to go forward and plan something themselves, and having that accountability piece of having multiple avenues open for continued feedback and acting on that feedback and allocating money based on that feedback. So that's some of what I was thinking about. And I don't know if anything I said resonated with any of you faceless people out there that we know several of when you were thinking about your own space.
I can speak to a little bit. Claire, hi everybody, this is Emily. Specifically, I think the piece that you just shared that resonated with me the most was that acceptance that because of the space that we're having to operate in, being a university, being in Utah, and then just broadening that lens wider and wider and wider, right? The acceptance that there's a lot of trust building needed. You can't just necessarily hit the ground running because of this understanding of where we're operating within, when we reach out or when we're communicating, what umbrella are we under that people might already have lived experience not feeling wholly comfortable within. And then for myself, especially as a designer, some of my work going through these different stages, particularly analysis, is opening myself to being critical of methods that we've tried to use, or have we tried to reach these specific audiences before, being aware and accepting that can be a little uncomfortable to feel, right, that you've failed or that something could have been done so much better to better increase inclusivity versus that exclusivity, and thinking of ways that we can engage with these groups in channels and spaces that are comfortable to them, not necessarily forcing them to feel comfortable in our space, but how can we reach and communicate within spaces they already find safety within to start that trust building and maintain that trust building.
It's all really great. Thank you, Emily. I want to put out there, if maybe you're not feeling like in an action-minded or solution-minded space, which is totally fair, does anyone want to voice current challenges or barriers they're having, either in a professional space or a personal space around this topic?
Right now, I'm thinking about the allies and accomplices piece of the action plan and how we are all here in this space right now. And so even just thinking about potentially working with our offices across campus or anything like that, like people here right now are a resource. And so that's also a good thing to keep in mind too, I think.
Yeah, good point, Jess. I don't know, does anyone want to share any allies or accomplices they were thinking about while doing this? Or literally any other thoughts you had about the exercise, we'll take any.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Paul. Sorry, I've been having hard internet problems, but I think for me, one of the things I've worked with a fair amount of like queer and trans students of color prior to the pandemic, but not nearly as much during. And so I know that like kind of access is a big issue. So what are your thoughts about like how do we address? I know a lot of places are working with kind of struggling with connecting to students, but any thoughts you all have?
Before I answer, I'd like to open that up to the collective because I will also share that just in general, student engagement's been hard, but we have noticed that for students with multiple minoritized identities are having a harder time accessing our office or our spaces. There's a comment, 2 comments here. So Katrina, learning abroad. providing resources to evaluate policies, practices for students that are helpful. Annie says, I see a ton of students. I meet with students even more than I did before the pandemic. And I'm someone who rarely met with them a ton. I wonder if we can do with more with bridging relationship with faculty. Annie, I think that's such a great point, because I really do feel like, particularly at this institution, I've felt such a wide chasm between the academic side of the house and, you know, oftentimes some of those really impactful moments is when a faculty member will put me in touch with a student, right? That there was a conversation that happened at office hours and the faculty thought it would be really helpful to get them in touch with our office. And I do know that across student affairs, it's been really tough to connect with students because students are tapped out, right? They're just unable to kind of take on anything else, be that co-curricular or sometimes even like reaching out for help when they need it can seem like too much. But one thing that they absolutely still have to keep doing if they want to stay enrolled is keep going to class and connect with their faculty. Zoom fatigue is so real. So yeah, I think that's a great suggestion, is how are we working together collectively to better support queer and trans students of color.
I'm thinking a bit about what Paul shared as well about access and noticing what students we are and aren't seeing a lot of in this particular climate. And like I facilitate a leadership program for the LGBT Resource Center and noticed a real difference in the students who applied this year and who were a part of the cohort. Traditionally, we don't see a whole lot of like students who are cis men in particular and white men who take part in this particular program, and saw significantly more cis white men applying than other identities that are usually present. And Jess and I had this conversation of assuming that this is probably an access thing or a capacity thing of you know, who has had significantly more responsibility or tasks placed on them, who is impacted by having to be virtual 24/7. And so we've had those conversations too, and have in some ways have been trying to address that Zoom fatigue piece on top of acknowledging access with broadband and privacy to take part in something for our office, taking part in our programs. They're loudly queer. And so occasionally students might not have the privacy to take part. And so doing our best to address that in one form through our Queer Conversations programming this spring and offering asynchronous content and engagement. So folks don't have to come to a Zoom meeting to still have access to the content that we're talking about. So we're offering a discussion forum on Discord for people to be able to talk about the web series that we're viewing together, where we're talking about issues of sexuality and gender intersecting with race and faith. And so I'm hoping personally that like offering this asynchronously will kind of address some of those issues of access that we see more greatly impact our queer and trans students of color over others.
Yeah, Paul, also speak to your point, something else we've been trying to get off the ground and it's been slow going, but I think we've got enough to get some momentum is in our Discord server, we have a couple private channels, one of which is for queer and trans students of color and one of which is for grad students. And so again, you know, if you don't have access to broadband internet or if you just cannot look at the screen anymore, it's not gonna be a solution there, but for students who might be looking for more online spaces to connect with other students at the university, our hope is in that opening up this space will give that opportunity. It's been a slow going process to recruit students to it. There's only a few right now. So I think at this point, we're just gonna kind of keep moving forward and see what we can do. But Yeah, if anyone else has ideas or want to put forward things that they've seen, I do want to note we are at time, so if you need to go, please feel free to see yourself out, but we're happy to sit around for another few minutes if there's other things people want to share. And I absolutely agree with you, Annie. I get the sense a lot of students are just like, I am just going to wait this pandemic out. Like, I will consider what engagement or co-curriculars or leadership opportunities look like. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Annie. We will be following up. I believe the series organizers will be following up with next steps, and will link to resources.
I've shared a slide here for folks who are still hanging around, just our contact info. I feel like very many of you know us and know how to contact us, but those of you who are with us who might not frequently be in contact with our center, here's our contact info.
Would anyone like the last word? Well, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day for this conversation. Our hope was that this would just spark some ideas or inspiration, and that you can take this and after this session, continue working through those thoughts on your own, invite a colleague out for a coffee to talk about it, or get on the phone with someone at another institution who maybe is doing something really cool that you want to replicate. And please, if you have other ideas or if you have questions that you prefer to talk to us about in a different space, you can always reach out to us.